welcome back to Otaku no Video as always. Thank you very, very much for joining me. I am here today with a review of Serial Experiments Lain. Now, I have to start with a caveat. I have long called Lain my favorite anime of all time. And, I mean, I love a lot of anime, so that's a tough thing to really come to, but it's true. And the problem with that is that tends to color one's perspective when you're reviewing something that you really love. So just understand that I'm coming to it from a fan's perspective. What is Lain? 13-episode anime TV series that was released in 1998. It was directed by Ryotaro Nakamura, who went on to direct Kino's Journey, among other things. It was conceived and executive produced by Yasuyuki Ueda, who worked for Pioneer for a long time. Now Jenny On is working on a lot of different projects. Character designs by Yoshitoshi Abe, who was discovered for this project. He was in college at the time. I'm not sure quite when he graduated college versus when, all that stuff. But he was, I believe, in college when they found him for this, which is important, as I'll talk about later. And written by Chiaki J. Konaka, who's written a lot of anime over time, a lot of different kinds of anime, but is also known as a horror writer. And this is very important for how Lain is structured, as we'll get to in a bit. Now, as Wikipedia puts it, quote, "The word weird appears almost systematically in English language reviews of this series," end quote. And yeah, weird is probably the best word to describe Lain, as I'll explain. To understand Lain, look at the title. Serial, i.e. episodic, experiments. Lain, the main character. This anime was an experiment. In fact, it was conceived as being so outside the anime norm that it was seen as extremely risky by the studio and the companies financing it. So much so that the first episode was produced essentially on spec as a demo and a test. And so they had to go make the first episode, then go back to the company and present it and show that they could actually do this the way they wanted to, and it would actually work. And then they got the go-ahead to do the rest of the series. And a good example of that is the art and the animation. Now, Lain is a fairly low-budgeted anime. That said, it's inexpensive, but it's not cheap. It doesn't look bad. In fact, they do a very good job with the budget they have in terms of doing what they need to with it. Rarely are there sequences which feel like, oh my gosh, they're not drawing just to save on time. But there's not a lot of stuff, which is not a problem because there's no action in Lain. There's very little romance, frankly. There's basically no comedy. So it doesn't need to do a lot of flashy animation. And one thing that really helps is Yoshitoshi Abe's character designs. Now, anime and manga were off limits in his house growing up, so he claims. So he does not have a typical anime or manga design style. He has characters with these very round eyes and very round bodies that are quite distinctive. You can really tell an Abe design when you see it. Moreover, because the show is so experimental, sometimes the characters aren't animated in the same way, but that's often intentional. They're trying to communicate something with that different animation style. Maybe more kinetic to get across the energy that these characters have. That said, there are certainly cases where characters are just kind of weirdly off-model, but it's minimal and the show definitely works artistically. Moreover, the show uses this very muted color palette. Now, it's not that sort of sepia tone of, say, Boogie Pop Phantom, but anime tends to be very colorful and very bright. Think Tarakagako no Railgun or Index or shows like that. This is not like that. Lots of blacks and browns and beiges and tones like that, yellows. It feels more like a dingy city than anything else. The direction, Nakamura's direction also helps a lot. Lots of unusual camera angles. Again, it's very experimental. In fact, this looks a lot like an experimental film, if you're used to those. There'll be a lot of long shots holding on something so you can really appreciate what that thing is. There's a really devastating scene halfway through with Lain's family where which is just held very long so you understand the discomfort and the confusion and something's just not right, which works very, 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 very well. Also, a lot of just abrupt editing. Things will jump from one thing to another. Again, intentionally, but it can be kind of confusing. Um, One of the most interesting things about Lain actually is the characters and the fact that the characters have very unusual relationships. The main character, Lain Iwakura, is very shy and withdrawn girl. She has basically no real friends. And so part of the story is the question of what connections and relationships she makes over the course of the show. And most of these relationships are very strained. She just doesn't really know how to do that. And so seeing what she does and how other people kind of try to draw her out is fascinating. And we very rarely see that in anime. I mean, I think it's very, very important to see a show like this, which is about somebody who is shy, legitimately shy, and would kind of like to not be shy, but that's life, which is awesome. And it's one of the great things about Lain is it's very much about real life. It tries to be non-anime, it tries to be more realistic. And the relationships in general are very interesting, and there's a lot of work done with what exact relationships that the different characters have. Speaking of characters, voice acting, excellent in both English and Japanese. By excellent, I mean very appropriate to the characters, which is hard in this, where the characters aren't bouncing around, slicing people's heads off, things like that. It's a much more down-to-earth, realistic sort of way of doing things. And it can be very difficult for a voice actor to portray somebody who's just sitting on the other side of a desk discussing something, where it's not high drama. I mean, there's plenty of drama in it, but it's not the typical sort of fantasy or science fiction kind of drama. Also, this is one of the few dubs which is generally acknowledged to be as good in both English and Japanese, much like Cowboy Bebop, and just excellent. And actually, in both cases, the dub casts were not particularly well known. They weren't huge dub actors, but have gone on to be very, very solid actors. So great stuff there. The writing and the story and so forth can be very confusing, and this is one of the reasons why I don't go on and on recommending that people watch Lain. The first half of the show or so is very confusing. It's laying a lot of groundwork, but you're not, it's not even trying to assemble all the pieces until the second half of the show. So it can be just very head-scratching for the first 6 episodes or so, and then in fact, there's a scene where things really start to come together, and you're like, oh, that is what's going on there. And then it starts to accelerate. So I know I have a friend who started watching it, just couldn't get into it. And that's totally fine. And I don't mean that even that you need to be smart to understand it, although you do, but I can totally understand even smart folks who just aren't into this kind of a thing. That's totally fine. This is an acquired taste, if you will. Also, the writing is, again, it structures the story more like a horror story, more like a thriller, where it's more about conversation, people trying to understand things, but it's also weirdly non-real. I mean, if you're familiar with the concept of the unreliable narrator in fiction, i.e. you may be reading a novel, but it's from the perspective of a crazy person, so what they're experiencing isn't actually reality. Lain isn't quite like that, but things happen that aren't actually happening, but it's what the character thinks is happening. And stuff like that. And there are sometimes sequences where you go back later and realize, oh, what I saw was actually this character thinking that. Or, reality was a little twisted in this certain way. So that can be frustrating, but it's just how Lain does things. And it's very, very interesting to watch an anime where reality is subjective. Now, that does not mean that there are no rules. It's one of the brilliant things about Lain is the fact that they don't just take that and run with it. It's very carefully designed and very carefully structured. So the things you see are there for a reason. But the fact that there's somebody floating in front of you, there may be a reason that person is floating off the ground. Anyway. And again, anime doesn't do this, so it's awesome. To wrap up a little bit, I actually want to talk a little bit about the music, which is perfect for what it's trying to do. It's moody, it's oppressive, it's electronic, which technology is a very fundamental theme in Lain, and it's off-kilter. It's often somewhat atonal and strange and makes you feel uncomfortable in the way the characters are often uncomfortable. So I've been talking a lot about all these various elements. What is Lain actually? What's the story? What it's about? Lain Iwakura is this shy girl who gets, well, she gets an email from a dead person, basically, which gets her pulled in to a lot of strange things going on in Lain's version of the internet. Now, the show is set in sort of an alternate present or an alternate near future where technology is just a little bit different, and they call the internet the Wired. So she gets pulled into these weird things going on in the Wired relating to the internet versus reality and online relationships and things like that. So Lain is about, if I can pull up my notes here, Lain is about identity and technology and how those two collide, especially in terms of things like who are you in real life versus who you are online. You know, is what you type in a text box in a comment field exactly what you would say to that person, you know, if you were speaking to them. It's about human relationship and connection and personal meaning. Lain has certain abilities and certain innate skills, and as she learns about that, she starts encountering questions of what she should do with that and what is the responsible thing to do with that, especially in the context of human relationship and how people relate and how people connect to each other is very, very central to Lain. In fact, I think it is the central theme of Lain. Lain changed my life. Literally, I came out of Lain with a fundamentally different view of what it means to have human relationships. And I don't want to go into any further detail of that because then I'd be trying to explain Lain or explain my reaction to Lain, and at some point you got to watch the show yourself and make your own decision. So I hope I have gotten you kind of interested in Lain and explained some of the interesting things about it. I could talk on and on and on about it if I wanted to. There's lots of detail to it, but partly I want to leave you wondering, because this is a mysterious anime, and the more I talk about it, the less mysterious it gets. So I'd rather you hear about it and be intrigued. If you have watched Lain or want to, and want to talk about it, or want to talk about anime or manga in general, stop by my blog at otakunovideo.net. Shoot me an email, brent@otakunovideo.net, or tweet me on Twitter at otakunovideo. Thank you very much, and I hope you all spend some time in the Wired. Until next time, let's see here. Until next time, blast it. I don't know. I don't have an ending. Until next time, close the world, open the next.